The rain fell in steady sheets across the parking lot of the Beaverton Police Department that November afternoon, drumming against the concrete with the same relentless rhythm that had marked every autumn in Oregon for as long as Detective Frank Alvarez could remember. He sat at his desk, surrounded by case files that seemed to multiply with each passing year, when the front desk officer appeared at his door with an expression he'd never seen before, somewhere between confusion and disbelief. A man had walked in 20 minutes ago, she explained, claiming to be Daniel Pritchard, the same Daniel Pritchard who had vanished without a trace 14 years ago when he was just 17 years old. Before we continue with this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more true stories like this one. The news hit the Pritchard family like lightning splitting an ancient oak. Janet Pritchard had been folding laundry in her modest ranch house on the outskirts of Hillsborough when her phone rang, the number showing the local police department. Her hands trembled as she listened, the basket of clean clothes tumbling to the floor, forgotten. Her son, her Daniel, was alive. For 14 years, she had carried the weight of not knowing, oscillating between hope and despair with each anniversary of his disappearance. She had attended candlelight vigils, organized search parties, and plastered missing person posters on every telephone pole within a 50-mile radius. She had imagined every possible scenario, from kidnapping to voluntary disappearance, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. Daniel's disappearance in October 2011 had torn through the community like wildfire through dry timber. He had been a quiet but capable student at Glencoe High School, working part-time at a local grocery store to save money for college. On the evening of October 17th, he told his mother he was going to study at a friend's house and would be home by 10. He never arrived at the friend's house, and he never came home. His beat-up Honda Civic was found 3 days later in a commuter parking lot near the Portland Max light rail station. Keys still in the ignition, his backpack on the passenger seat containing his wallet, identification, and $73 in cash. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no explanation. It was as if he had simply stepped out of his own life and vanished into the October mist. The investigation had consumed Detective Alvarez for the first 2 years. He interviewed everyone who knew Daniel, family members, classmates, teachers, co-workers, even casual acquaintances. He reviewed surveillance footage from every camera within a 2-mile radius of where the car was found. He coordinated with transit authorities, hospitals, homeless shelters, and coroner's offices across 3 states. But every lead evaporated like morning fog, leaving nothing behind but more questions. Janet Pritchard had aged a decade in those first 2 years, her auburn hair turning prematurely grey, deep lines etching themselves around her eyes. Her husband, Robert, had handled the loss differently. He withdrew into himself, spending longer hours at his construction job, speaking less and less until the silence in their home became its own presence. Their marriage didn't survive the 3rd anniversary of Daniel's disappearance. Now, standing in the small interview room at the police station, Detective Alvarez studied the man before him with the trained eye of someone who had spent 30 years reading people. He was undeniably older than the 17-year-old boy in the missing person poster, but the features were unmistakable. The same deep-set hazel eyes, the same slightly crooked nose from a childhood skateboarding accident, the same prominent Adam's apple. But there was something else, something harder to define. This man carried himself with a wariness that suggested years of looking over his shoulder, and his hands bore calluses and scars that spoke of manual labor and hardship. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful, as if each word required consideration before being released into the world. What stopped everyone cold, however, was the photograph. Daniel, if it truly was Daniel, had placed it on the table between them with trembling fingers. It was a Polaroid-style instant photo, slightly oversaturated in the way modern instant cameras produce, showing a man standing in front of a weathered fishing boat docked at what appeared to be a small marina. The date stamp in the corner read yesterday's date. The man in the photo was unmistakably the same person sitting across from them. Detective Alvarez felt his skepticism warring with the evidence before his eyes as he studied every detail of that photograph, looking for signs of manipulation or forgery. Janet Pritchard arrived at the police station within 40 minutes, though she lived nearly an hour away. She later couldn't remember the drive, couldn't recall whether she had obeyed traffic signals or speed limits, couldn't say if she had even locked her front door. Robert appeared 15 minutes after her, summoned by a phone call from his ex-wife that broke 4 years of near silence between them. They stood together in the hallway outside the interview room, neither touching nor speaking, united only by the impossibility of the moment they were about to experience. When Daniel, and it was Daniel, there was no denying it once Janet saw him, emerged from the interview room flanked by Detective Alvarez and a department psychologist, the sound that escaped from Janet's throat was something between a sob and a prayer. She moved toward him, her arms already reaching, but stopped when she saw him flinch backward. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it might as well have been a chasm opening between them. Robert's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the only sign of the emotional hurricane raging inside him. The reunion took place in a family conference room that the department typically used for victim services. Neutral territory, the psychologist explained, where everyone could feel safe. Daniel sat on one side of a long table, his parents on the other, close enough to touch, but separated by 14 years of absence and pain. Detective Alvarez and Dr. Patricia Osei, the department psychologist, remained present, mediating what would become a conversation that lasted nearly 4 hours. The story Daniel told came in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across more than a decade. He had been dealing with depression and anxiety during his senior year, he explained, pressures that he had never articulated to anyone. The expectations of college, of choosing a future, of living up to the potential everyone saw in him. It had all become overwhelming. On that October evening, he had boarded the MAX train with no destination in mind, just a need to escape. He rode the rails until late evening, ending up in downtown Portland as the city's nightlife began to stir. In Pioneer Courthouse Square, he encountered a group of young people who lived on the margins. Travelers, they called themselves, moving from city to city with little more than backpacks and determination. They spoke of freedom from expectation, of living outside the conventional structures that seemed to crush the spirit. In his vulnerable state, their philosophy seemed like an answer to prayers he hadn't known how to voice. By dawn, Daniel Pritchard had become someone else. He chose not to take his wallet or identification because bringing them would mean bringing the weight of who he was supposed to be. The years that followed were a blur of movement and survival. He traveled up and down the West Coast, working under the table in restaurants, on fishing boats, in orchards during harvest season, at construction sites that didn't ask too many questions. He became skilled at staying invisible, at not drawing attention, at existing in the spaces between society's structures. In Seattle, he worked at a fish processing plant for 2 years. In Eureka, California, he crewed on a crab boat for a season. In Medford, he harvested pears alongside migrant workers who asked no questions about his past. He told his parents that he had convinced himself they would be better off believing he was dead than knowing he had simply chosen to leave. But the human heart is not designed for perpetual isolation. About 3 years ago, Daniel explained, he had begun experiencing what he could only describe as a profound loneliness that no amount of movement could outrun. He started to remember not just his family, but who he had been before the weight of expectation had crushed him. He thought about his mother's laugh, his father's quiet strength, the smell of Janet's famous blueberry pancakes on Sunday mornings, the way Robert had taught him to swing a hammer with precision and respect for the craft. The memories, once sources of pain, had become lifelines back to himself. What finally brought him home was a near miss on a fishing boat off the Oregon coast 2 weeks ago. A winch cable had snapped during a storm, missing Daniel's head by inches and killing a man standing 10 feet behind him. As he knelt on the rain-slicked deck, holding the hand of a dying stranger, Daniel experienced what he could only describe as clarity. Life was too short and too precious to spend it running from the people who loved him. That night, docked in Newport, he told the boat captain he was leaving. The captain, a gruff man named Pete Vonderheide, who had seen enough of life to know when not to ask questions, took the Polaroid photo the next morning before Daniel hitchhiked south toward home. The days following Daniel's return were marked by a strange mix of joy and painful adjustment. The media descended on the story like gulls on chum, and Detective Alvarez had to coordinate with the department's public information officer to manage the circus that threatened to engulf the Pritchard family. "Local teen returns. After 14 years missing," screamed the headlines, though Daniel was no longer a teen but a 31-year-old man whose face bore the lines and scars of a difficult decade and a half. Janet took a leave of absence from her job at the county clerk's office to be with Daniel, though being with him proved more complicated than she had imagined. He stayed in his childhood bedroom, which she had maintained exactly as he had left it, a shrine to the boy he had been. But the man who returned couldn't quite fit into that space anymore. He woke at dawn out of habit from years of working sunrise jobs. He was uncomfortable with the abundance of food in the refrigerator, often eating only what he needed, and nothing more. He flinched at loud noises and preferred to keep his back to walls when sitting in rooms. These were the markers, Dr. Osei explained, of someone who had spent years in survival mode. Robert, who had moved to a small apartment in Beaverton after the divorce, began stopping by the house every evening after work. At first, the conversations were stilted and surface level, discussions of weather, of news, of anything except the elephant in the room. But gradually, Robert brought his tools, and he and Daniel began working together on small projects around Janet's house. They replaced rotted boards on the back deck, fixed a leaking faucet, installed new weather stripping on the doors. In the shared language of craftsmanship, they began rebuilding something that words alone could not construct. The broader family and community reaction was complex. Daniel's younger sister, Ashley, who had been 10 when he disappeared and was now 24 with a nursing degree and a fiancé, struggled with anger alongside her relief. She had grown up in the shadow of her missing brother, watching her parents' marriage crumble and bearing the weight of being the child who remained. Their first conversation, mediated by Dr. Osei, was tense and tear-filled. Ashley needed Daniel to understand the devastation his absence had caused, and Daniel needed her to understand that mental health struggles can make seemingly incomprehensible decisions feel like the only option. It would take months of family therapy before they began to forge a relationship built on who they were now, not who they had been. Friends from high school reacted with a mix of astonishment and awkwardness. Kevin Brennan, who had been Daniel's closest friend and had provided the alibi that Daniel never showed up to study that night, came to Janet's house one evening in early December. The two men, now in their 30s, sat on the back porch in the winter cold for 3 hours, working through 14 years of absence. Kevin had gone on to become an electrical engineer, was married with 2 children, had built the life that Daniel had run from. But instead of judgment, Kevin offered understanding. He had also struggled with anxiety in his youth, he confessed, but had found help through therapy and medication. He gave Daniel the number of his therapist and made him promise to call. The legal and administrative complications of Daniel's return proved Byzantine in their complexity. He had no valid identification, no social security card, no proof of employment history, no credit history, no bank account. He had essentially become a ghost in the system, and becoming real again required navigating a labyrinth of bureaucracy. Detective Alvarez connected the family with a social worker who specialized in helping displaced persons reintegrate into society. And together, they began the slow process of reconstructing Daniel Pritchard's legal existence. Dr. Jose, who continued to work with Daniel twice weekly, diagnosed him with complex trauma related to untreated depression and anxiety, compounded by years of unstable living conditions and the psychological burden of his self-imposed exile. She was careful to explain to both Daniel and his family that healing would not be linear. There would be good days and hard days, progress and setbacks. The important thing was to keep moving forward with compassion and patience. One evening in late December, as Janet prepared dinner and Daniel sat at the kitchen table sorting through old photo albums, he paused on a picture of himself at his high school graduation ceremony that had never happened. Janet had had someone Photoshop his face onto a stock photo of a graduate, creating an image of a moment that never existed. She had done it, she explained with tears in her eyes, so that she could imagine him achieving that milestone, even if she couldn't be there to see it. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time before speaking. "I'm sorry," was all he could manage, but it was enough for that moment. By the time winter gave way to an early spring, Daniel had begun to establish routines that marked a life being rebuilt. He obtained his GED through a local community college program, the first step toward reclaiming an education interrupted 14 years earlier. He found work with a small construction company whose owner, a friend of Robert's, was willing to pay him legitimately once his documentation was sorted. He opened a bank account with Janet's help, depositing the modest savings he had somehow managed to accumulate during his years of transient work. These were small victories, but each one represented a step away from the shadow existence he had inhabited for so long. The Polaroid photograph, the one that had announced his return so dramatically, remained in Detective Alvarez's case file, but Daniel had a copy printed and framed. He kept it on the dresser in his childhood bedroom, not as a celebration of his lost years, but as a reminder of the moment he chose to come home. Piet von der Heide, the fishing boat captain who had taken the photo, sent a letter through a friend of a friend, wishing Daniel well and telling him that the boat would always have a berth for him if he needed work. Daniel wrote back thanking him, but explaining that he had a different kind of fishing to do now, fishing for the pieces of himself that he had scattered across the Pacific Northwest. Janet and Robert's relationship remained complicated. They were not getting back together. Too much water had passed under that bridge, too many words left unspoken or spoken in anger. But they found a new equilibrium, a friendship built on shared history and shared purpose. They attended family therapy sessions together, working through their own grief and guilt surrounding Daniel's disappearance. Robert confessed that he had blamed himself for not recognizing his son's mental health struggles. Janet admitted that she had been so focused on Daniel's academic achievements that she had missed the warning signs of his distress. Together, they learned to forgive themselves and each other. Ashley's relationship with her brother evolved slowly. She brought her fiancé, Carlos Reyes, to meet Daniel in February, and the two men bonded over their shared experience of coming from difficult circumstances. Carlos had immigrated from Guatemala as a teenager and understood something of what it meant to rebuild an identity in a new context. Ashley began to see her brother not as the person who had abandoned her, but as someone who had been lost and was finding his way home. She invited him to be part of her wedding planning, and though Daniel initially felt unworthy of the honor, he accepted. The community of Hillsborough, which had rallied around the Pritchard family during the dark years of Daniel's absence, now rallied around his return. The grocery store where he had worked as a teenager offered him a job in their warehouse. The high school counselor, who had organized the initial search efforts 14 years ago, reached out to see if Daniel would be willing to speak to students about mental health and the importance of asking for help. Local churches and community organizations that had kept the family in their prayers welcomed him back with a gentleness that sometimes brought him to tears. But perhaps the most significant development came in early April when Daniel enrolled in classes at Portland Community College. He started with just 2 courses, Introductory Psychology and English Composition, testing the waters of formal education after so many years away. On his first day of class, carrying a new backpack and armed with fresh notebooks and pens that Janet had insisted on buying, he felt a flutter of the old anxiety that had driven him away. But this time, he recognized it for what it was. He had Dr. Osie's number programmed into his phone. He had Kevin's standing offer to talk any time. He had his family, fractured but healing, supporting him. He had tools now that he hadn't possessed at 17. Detective Alvarez closed the official case file on Daniel Pritchard's disappearance with a designation he had rarely used in his career. Resolved. Subject returned. But he kept a personal note in his desk drawer, a reminder that not all mysteries end in tragedy and that sometimes the missing find their way home. He attended Ashley's wedding in June, an unofficial capacity, but one that the family insisted on. He had, after all, been part of their story during its darkest chapter. It seemed fitting that he witness this brighter one. The 1-year anniversary of Daniel's return arrived with less fanfare than his initial appearance had generated. The media had long since moved on to other stories, and the Pritchard family was grateful for the return to relative anonymity. They gathered at Janet's house on a Sunday afternoon in November. Janet, Robert, Daniel, Ashley, Carlos, and a few close family friends, including Detective Alvarez and Kevin Brennan. Janet made her famous blueberry pancakes, even though it was late afternoon, because some traditions are important precisely because they connect us to who we were and who we might become. Daniel stood in the backyard, watching the autumn leaves fall from the old maple tree that had been there since his childhood. Ashley joined him, linking her arm through his, in a gesture of affection that would have been impossible a year earlier. "Do you ever regret coming back?" she asked quietly, a question she had been afraid to voice until now. Daniel considered it carefully, as he considered most things these days. "Every single day for the first few months," he answered honestly. "Not because being here isn't good, but because facing what I'd done and what I'd lost was harder than running. But no, I don't regret it anymore. Running was like being a ghost. I was breathing, but I wasn't really alive." Inside, Robert and Janet stood at the kitchen window, watching their children together in the fading afternoon light. "We're not who we were," Janet said softly. Robert nodded, understanding that she meant all of them, the family unit that had been shattered and was being reassembled in a new configuration, with new understanding. "No," he agreed, "but maybe that's okay. Maybe we're who we needed to become." That evening, as the gathering wound down and guests departed, Daniel retrieved something from his room. It was a journal that Dr. Osie had encouraged him to keep, a way of processing the complicated emotions that came with his reintegration. In it, he had written extensively about the guilt, the shame, the fear, and slowly, tentatively, the hope. He had written about the people he had met during his years away, the kind ones who had helped him, the hard ones who had taught him resilience, the broken ones who had shown him what happens when you run for too long. But mostly, he had written about the slow, difficult work of forgiveness, of his family for the expectations he had perceived, and most importantly, of himself. Janet found him sitting on the back porch steps as darkness fell, the journal open on his lap. She sat beside him, not saying anything, just being present. After a while, Daniel spoke. "I keep thinking about all the time I lost. 14 years I can never get back. All the moments I missed. Your birthdays, Ashley's graduation, your divorce, holidays, ordinary Tuesdays. I try to do the math sometimes to quantify what I threw away, but it's too much. The numbers don't work." Janet was quiet for a moment, then reached over and gently closed the journal. "You're right. You can't get those years back. None of us can. But you know what you can do? You can be here for all the years ahead. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's everything." They sat together in the November darkness, mother and son, both changed by absence and loss, both learning to live with scars that would never fully heal, but no longer needed to define them. By the following spring, Daniel's life had taken on a shape that resembled normalcy, though he had learned that normal was a relative term. He was taking a full course load at Portland Community College, working toward an associate degree in social work. The career choice surprised no one who knew his story. He wanted to work with at-risk youth, to be the intervention for others that he had needed but never received at 17. His professors noted his unusual maturity and the depth of insight he brought to class discussions, the kind that only comes from lived experience. He moved out of his childhood bedroom and into a small studio apartment in Portland's Lentz neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, affordable on his construction wages and modest student loans. But it was his. He decorated it simply: a futon, a desk for studying, bookshelves made from cinder blocks and planks, and on the wall above his desk, 3 photographs. One was the Polaroid from that November day when he had decided to come home. One was a recent photo from Ashley's wedding, showing the whole family together and smiling, fractured but healing. The third was an old snapshot from his childhood, taken on a camping trip to Crater Lake, showing him between his parents with a gap-toothed grin before anxiety and depression had taught him that happiness could be complicated. His relationship with his family continued to deepen and evolve. He had dinner with Janet every Thursday evening, a standing date that they both protected fiercely. He worked with Robert on weekends sometimes, learning more about construction and carpentry, finding peace in the creation of tangible things. He and Ashley developed their own rhythm: text messages with bad jokes, occasional lunch dates where they tried new restaurants, a slowly building trust that what they had now would continue to be there tomorrow. The mental health support that had seemed so intimidating at first had become a lifeline. He saw Dr. Jose weekly, working through not just his past trauma, but developing tools for managing anxiety and depression in healthy ways. He joined a support group for young adults dealing with mental health challenges and found strength in shared experiences. He stayed in regular contact with Kevin Brennan, who had become a friend again, not just a connection to the past, but a bridge to a future where Daniel could be whole. There were still hard days. Days when the weight of what he had done pressed down like a physical force. Days when he walked past a transit station and felt the old urge to board a train to anywhere else. Days when the work of being present felt exhausting. On those days, he used the tools he had developed. He called his therapist or his sponsor from the support group. He went to his construction job and lost himself in the rhythm of physical work. He showed up to family dinner even when he wanted to hide. He had learned that healing wasn't about the absence of struggle. It was about having the courage to struggle and the wisdom to ask for help. In late May, Daniel did something he had been working toward for months. With Dr. Ose's support and his family in attendance, he spoke at an assembly at his old high school about mental health, disappearance, and the importance of asking for help. Standing in the same auditorium where he had once sat as a student, looking out at hundreds of faces of teenagers who seemed so young to him now, he told his story with unflinching honesty. He talked about the pressure he had felt, the depression he hadn't known how to name, the decision that had seemed like escape, but was actually just a different kind of prison. He talked about the cost, not just to himself, but to everyone who loved him. And he talked about coming home, about the hard work of rebuilding, about the possibility of healing. When he finished speaking, the silence in the auditorium was profound. Then a hand went up, and then another, and then dozens more. The questions came in a flood, vulnerable, honest questions from teenagers wrestling with their own struggles. How did you know it was time to come back? What if you feel like your family would be better off without you? Where do you start when everything feels overwhelming? Daniel answered each question with the same honesty he had brought to his story, while Janet sat in the back row with tears streaming down her face, and Robert sat beside her, his hand finding hers in a gesture of shared pain and shared hope. After the assembly, several students approached Daniel to thank him. One young woman, a junior with visible cuts on her forearms, asked if they could talk privately. Under Dr. Ozzy's supervision, Daniel spent an hour with her, sharing his story in more detail, and helping her understand that asking for help wasn't weakness, but courage. Before she left, she gave him a fierce hug and whispered, "Thank you for coming back. Not just home, but here, today." It was, Daniel reflected later, one of the most meaningful moments of his life. The second anniversary of Daniel's return arrived quietly, marked not by gatherings or ceremonies, but by the simple fact of continued presence. Daniel had completed his associate degree and had been accepted to Portland State University to pursue a bachelor's degree in social work. He had been promoted to assistant foreman at the construction company, a recognition of both his skills and his reliability. He had started dating someone he met through his support group, taking things slowly, but allowing himself to hope that intimacy and trust might be possible for him. Ashley gave birth to her first child in August, a daughter named Luna Grace Reyes. When she asked Daniel to be the godfather, he wept with gratitude for the trust she was placing in him. Holding his infant niece for the first time, feeling the weight of her tiny body and the awesome responsibility of being someone she could count on, Daniel understood in a new way what his return had meant. His absence hadn't just affected the past, it would have shaped the future in ways both large and small. Luna would grow up knowing her uncle, learning from his mistakes, but also from his courage in facing them. That, he thought, might be the most important legacy of all. Detective Alvarez retired from the force that fall, and at his retirement party, he sought Daniel out. "Your case haunted me for years," he admitted. "Every unsolved missing persons case does. But I want you to know that your return, it gave me something I needed, hope. A reminder that sometimes the lost find their way home." Daniel shook his hand and thanked him for never giving up, for being there when he finally came back. They promised to stay in touch, and surprisingly, they did. Janet and Robert's relationship had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, a deep friendship built on hard-won wisdom and shared history. They attended therapy together still, working through the last vestiges of their own trauma. They went to Daniel's university graduation ceremony together, sitting side by side and cheering embarrassingly loudly when his name was called. They celebrated holidays together, their fractured family finding a new shape that worked. They had learned that sometimes breaking is necessary to rebuild something stronger. For Daniel, the Polaroid photograph remained on his wall, but he had added something to the frame. Below the image, he had written a quote from a poem he had discovered in one of his literature classes: "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The photo no longer represented just the moment he decided to come home. It represented the entire journey, the breaking and the healing, the running and the returning, the boy who left and the man who came back. He had learned that healing wasn't a destination, but a practice, something you chose every day. Some days that choice was easy, filled with joy and connection and hope. Some days it was hard, requiring every ounce of courage and every tool in his arsenal. But every day, he made the choice. To be present, to be honest, to be here. That, he had learned, was what it meant to truly come home, not to a place, but to yourself. On quiet evenings, when he sat in his apartment studying for exams or preparing for his internship at a youth crisis center, Daniel sometimes thought about the boy he had been at 17. The boy who felt so overwhelmed by expectation and pressure that disappearing seemed like the only option. He felt profound compassion for that boy now, understanding that he had been sick and scared and hadn't known how to ask for help. But he also felt grateful to the man who had stood on a dock in Newport with his life in ruins and decided to come home. Both of them, the boy who left and the man who returned, were part of his story, and he was finally learning to make peace with all of it. The case of Daniel Pritchard's disappearance and return became something of a local legend, referenced in mental health awareness campaigns and taught as a case study in crisis intervention courses. But for Daniel and his family, it was simply their life, complicated, painful, beautiful, and ongoing. They had learned that mysteries don't always end with neat resolutions, that healing takes longer than anyone expects, and that the courage to come home is matched only by the courage required to stay. Years would pass. Daniel would complete his degree and begin working as a crisis counselor, helping other lost souls find their way home. Ashley and Carlos would have 2 more children, and Uncle Daniel would be a constant presence in their lives. Janet would eventually retire and take up painting, finding in art a way to express emotions that words had never quite captured. Robert would teach Daniel advanced carpentry, and together they would build furniture for Ashley's growing family. The scars would remain, but they would fade, becoming part of the landscape rather than the whole terrain. And sometimes, on November evenings when the rain fell in steady sheets across Oregon, Daniel would take out that Polaroid photograph and remember. Not with regret or shame, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the boat captain who took the picture. Gratitude for the detective who never closed his case. Gratitude for the family who welcomed him home despite everything. Gratitude for the second chance that not everyone gets. The photo showed a man at a crossroads, and every time Daniel looked at it, he was reminded that he had chosen the harder path, the path home, and that choice had made all the difference.